Hello YouTube. So you might notice that I am recording this video while lying in bed, and shortly I will upload another video which explains exactly why I'm lying in bed. But what I want to talk about today is relativism about truth. So I'm a relativist about truth, and I endorse global relativism. I endorse relativism about truth just across the board. I say there are no objective truths, no absolute truths. So all truth is relative to one's perspective. This is not a popular position, and one of the uh, objections or obstacles that I sometimes encounter when talking about this position is I think that, you know, so for some people, I think some people have the sense that relativism about truth is just sort of incomprehensible. It just doesn't even make sense. We can't even get any clear idea of like what truth is even supposed to be if you are a relativist. Now, there are various technical objections to the coherence of relativism, and I actually have another video where I've talked about these sort of classic technical objections in detail. I'll upload that in the I'll link that in the description. But I think there's also just this more intuitive problem that some people have with relativism. I've encountered this, just in talking to people where it just kind of doesn't even make, they don't think it even makes sense, right? Like they just can't kind of get their head around what is even being said um, when you say that truth is relative. So I just want to talk about this a bit today because I think I find this a bit puzzling because if you think through the traditional philosophical theories of truth, there's no obvious incompatibility with relativism. In fact, relativism seems to drop out quite naturally from at least some philosophical theories of truth. So that's what I want to talk about today. Um, so, okay, let's let's go through some of the kind of classic philosophical theories of truth. Um, so, first of all, there are correspondence theories. So the general idea of the correspondence theory of truth is that a proposition is true just in case it corresponds to the way the world is, or it corresponds to a fact or a state of affairs. So truth consists in the correspondence of a proposition to some fact. For example, if I state the proposition "the cat is on the mat," uh, if let's say that proposition is true, so it's true that the cat is on the mat. Well, then the claim is that what makes this true is that there is some state of affairs in the world. So there's like so the cat picks out a particular object, namely a cat. The mat picks out another object, namely a mat, and of course these two objects are related in a particular kind of way. So the proposition "the cat is on the mat," like it corresponds to the relevant state of affairs. That's the basic idea, and I think that's a very kind of commonsensical way of thinking about what truth is, right? Like, yeah, okay, so for a proposition to be true is for it to match or correspond to the way the world is. Um, Now, I think that this is probably just intuitively the hardest case for relativism because I think that it's going to seem that if you endorse the correspondence theory, then you're going to think, well, there's just some way that the world is independently of us, right? And the way the world is, that doesn't depend on what we think or believe or what our theories are or what our perspectives are or anything like that, right? There's a way the world is, mind independently, and then we formulate propositions about the world, and those propositions can match or fail to match the world, right? But like the world is just kind of out there, and the truth is determined by just what's going on out there. So how on earth can it make sense to say that that truth is relative? Um, well, I think there are actually several ways that relativism can emerge. I mean, first of all, I should say that correspondence theory historically has been, I think it's sort of associated with more realist positions, with positions that would be opposed to the kind of relativist views that I hold. But even so, I don't think that there's any incompatibility between um, correspondence theory and relativism. So one obvious option is just to say, well, so one obvious option for a relativist would be to simply relativize facts or states of affairs as well. So if you're a relativist about truth who endorses the correspondence theory, then what you would say is okay, well, a proposition is true just in case it corresponds to a fact, um, but facts are relative to our perspectives too. So this is the sort of view that would be endorsed by somebody like Nelson Goodman. Nelson Goodman, he has a book called Ways of World Making. Goodman says, no, we literally make the world, right? Like, so on Goodman's view, yeah, I mean, I suppose you could say that like a proposition is true just in case it corresponds to the world, but like we make the worlds. So one way in which we, for instance, make worlds on Goodman's view would be by I don't know, adopting some framework for carving out different objects. Like when I look around my room, I can see various objects in my room. I can say that there's a table, there's a chair, there's a computer, and this is in fact, like on Goodman's view, yeah, this is a description of a world. But this is something that like this is a world that like I have carved out. Um, so when I say that like there's a table to my left, to my right, um, well, I mean, there's no yeah, like that particular sort of way of carving things out, that particular way of distinguishing that object from other objects was not forced upon me. It's not imposed upon me. There are many other alternative ways you could uh, carve up the world. You could just talk about collections of atoms, I suppose. And of course, if you think of it in terms of collections of atoms, then there's trillions and trillions of different ways of drawing the lines around those atoms so as to carve out tables out of them, right? Like so, this collection of atoms to my right, I can draw loads and loads of different lines around it, which would you know give us a table, as it were. So anyway, the thought on a sort of Goodmanian position would be, well, okay, yeah, truth is correspondence to the world, but there are multiple worlds, and there's multiple ways of world making. Um, so that's one option, right? Is for the relativist to relativize facts, relativize ways the world is. I think another option for the relativist is to focus on the correspondence relation. So we're saying that truth consists in the correspondence of a proposition to the world. But what exactly is it for a proposition to correspond to the world? Like, what is it for it like a proposition to match the world? So let's say again, I take something like just these like common sense objects around me, and I say, okay, the table is flat. So I've got a table here, and I'm saying the table is flat. Well, you know, if we take it that this proposition is true, then it seems that that's going to rest at least partly on what our standards are for what counts as a relevant match. So, I mean, one point, as I've already mentioned, is when I use this term, the table, I'm picking out a particular object, but like so I'm taking it that the table refers to an object, but actually there are countless trillions of potential objects that the table could be referring to, because again there's countless trillions of ways of drawing the lines around the collection of atoms, or whatever the underlying reality may be. Maybe it's not atoms, but there's countless trillions of ways of drawing the lines there. The other thing is that even once we've specified some way of picking out the objects, let's think about their properties. So I say the table is flat. Well, I mean, you know, uh, this table to my right is flat enough that I can place plenty of objects on it without them falling off and without them wobbling. On the other hand, if I was conducting a precision experiment in physics or something like that, then it's not really clear that I would want to say that the table is flat. In that context, uh, there's actually all sorts of bumps and ridges that would, interfere with the experiment, and I would be looking for something, with a much more precise construction than my table. Um, so the table is flat. So I'm taking it that the table is flat matches the world. But the question is, well, what counts as a match? And whether or not the table is flat counts as matching the world or counts as corresponding to the world seems to be dependent on my standards, values, goals, um, and it seems to be dependent on like how I'm kind of choosing to represent the world. Uh, so here is one way in which a relativist, so we might kind of get like relativism out of the correspondence theory is we might sort of challenge the idea, because I think that on the traditional correspondence theory, the thought is that there is some, it's like an objective fact of the matter whether a proposition corresponds to the world. Like there's this independent way the world is, and then there's this objective matching relation. And so relativists can kind of target both of those claims. They can deny that there's an independent way the world is, and then they can say, like, even if there is somehow an independent way the world is, like even if there is just something going on out there that's fixed independently of us, um, we can target this matching relation. We can say that the matching relation is something that is going to be dependent on our perspective. Um, so that's correspondence theory. So an alternative theory of truth is the coherence theory. According to the coherence theory, the truth of some proposition P consists in its coherence with other propositions. Now, I mean, there's going to be a lot of debate about what exactly coherence consists in. So, what exactly constitutes a coherent set of propositions. At the very least, I suppose we would insist on consistency. But generally, coherence theorists will require that the propositions in question, fit well together in some broader sense. So, we might insist that we have some set of propositions that exhibits a whole bunch of theoretical virtues, explanatory power, theoretical unification, pragmatic utility, simplicity. The propositions kind of support each other in some broad sense. But however we on the coherence theory, however we spell out what exactly coherence consists in, the key point is that the what makes a proposition true is not that it's like matching some independent world. The truth of the proposition consists in its relation to other propositions. Now, I think coherence theory is actually just very straightforwardly prima facie compatible with relativism. I mean, there's just no. In fact, this is a classic objection to coherence theory. So, a classic objection to coherence theories of truth is that the coherence theory entails relativism, because it seems that there could be multiple sets of propositions that are mutually inconsistent, but where these sets bear the relevant coherence relations. So I could have one set of propositions where that set is consistent and has great explanatory power and it's simple and all of that. Then there could be another incompatible set of propositions that is similarly, it's consistent, it's got explanatory power, it's simple and so on. But like they're incompatible. So in that case, like whether a proposition is true is going to be relative. It's going to be relative to these different coherent sets of propositions. So like again, it's it's kind of, from that point of view, it's just like, okay, well, we have something that actually quite naturally seems to lead to relativism. Now, I mean, again, we might impose increasingly strict requirements on what counts as coherency in order to try to rule out there being multiple inconsistent sets of propositions. Uh, but again, just prima facie, I don't think there's actually a problem for relativism here. Indeed, it seems that relativism is rather uh, it fits rather nicely with this kind of view. Um, so I won't really say much more about coherence theory. Okay, so then there are pragmatist theories of truth. So I guess the underlying, I mean, I always find pragmatist theories of truth a little bit difficult to talk about because, I find that pragmatist theories, to be completely honest, I still don't really understand what pragmatist theories actually are. Like I get the underlying intuition, but it just seems like so here's the problem. Whenever I try to sort of explain what pragmatist theories are, people always tell me that I get it wrong. So, and then like whenever I try to come to some better understanding of what pragmatism is, it just seems like pragmatism as a tradition has kind of broken off in so many different ways that I'm not sure what the kind of underlying basic idea is. I still struggle with that. So what I'm about to say, I'm sure that there's going to be a bunch of pragmatists who say, no, Kane, you've just got it. You're just talking bullshit. You've got it completely wrong. But I take it that the underlying motivation, the underlying intuition of pragmatist theories is that um, the true propositions are going to be those propositions which are, in some sense, useful to believe, or are um, they are so pragmatists are going to draw some sort of tighter connection between truth and our epistemic practices. Whereas these other theories of truth, like correspondence theory and coherence theory and so on, whereas they treat truth in a sort of abstract way, I guess pragmatists are going to focus on, the role of the concept of truth in various practices. So, like, they're going to begin with this question of, well, what is the role of the concept truth within some area of discourse? And in general, the truths will be those propositions that, I guess, play important roles in our best theories, that have fared well against critical examination, and so on. Again, different pragmatists are going to fill out these details in different ways. And I think there are certainly some classic formulations of pragmatism not that are going to be quite difficult to square with relativism. So, for Charles Sanders Peirce, for instance, he says that the truth is that which will be accepted at the end of inquiry. I think the phrase he uses is the opinion fated to be agreed to by all who investigate. So, on Peirce's view, I guess inquiry is like converging in a particular direction, and we're going to converge at one unique point. But we can easily take that kind of Peircean position, and I think a relativist can endorse that kind of position. But then they could just say, well, yeah, okay, fine. Truth is what will be, ultimately accepted at the end of inquiry. But then there isn't a unique end of inquiry that all investigators are fated to agree upon. In fact, there are just going to be kind of multiple ways that we can go. Um, I think certainly Peirce at least makes a very strong claim there. In fact, I think his claim is probably stronger than even many traditional realists would want to say. Like the idea that there's just this one view, one theory, one true theory that will be found at the end of inquiry. Um, so uh, so yeah, I think that um, we can sort of take this general pragmatist idea um, of thinking of truth as being, those. So the true propositions are those that fare well against critical examination. The truth is the true propositions are those that play some important role in our best theories. This seems to me to be very straightforwardly compatible with relativism. There's just no obvious difficulty with it being the case that there could be, that it's like just dependent on our sort of perspectives and interests, what fares well against critical examination. Um, uh, so again, for pragmatism, if anything, it seems to me that, if we sort of take like a reasonable pragmatism, if we're not endorsing some very strong claim about um, all investigators converging on a single theory at the end of inquiry or anything like that, seems to me that actually relativism drops out quite nicely. Like that seems quite compatible with that sort of view. Okay, so finally then, there are deflationary theories of truth. I take it that the basic motivation of deflationism is that truth is not a substantive property. So one way to think of this is that to to assert that a proposition is true is equivalent in some important sense to just asserting the proposition. So when I say the cat is on the mat is true, or it is true that the cat is on the mat, that's basically just equivalent to saying the cat is on the mat. Um, Now, I mean, there are different forms of deflationism, but they're all going to take it that like truth is defined in terms of the equivalent schema. So P is true if and only if P. And then beyond that, there's really not much further that can be said about the nature of the truth. There's no further content that is added to a proposition by the assertion that a proposition is true. Um, so I guess this sort of view, you know, I mean, maybe there's a worry that this raises for relativism, because you might say, well, the relativist is claiming that truth is relative to perspectives, but for truth to be relative in this, like for truth to be relative, it must be that, like we must be saying that truth is a relative property or something like that. So we have to be identifying truth with some property that is relative to perspectives, but for the deflationist, truth isn't a substantive property at all. Um, of course, notice that if you were to take that sort of objection to relativism, I think the very same problem would occur for any kind of non-relativist view of truth. So any kind of absolutist view of truth. If you're saying, well, um, like we just kind of can't say anything more about truth than what is said in something like the equivalence schema, and that's why relativism about truth doesn't work, then similarly non-relative, like you're not going to be able to be an absolutist about truth, you're not going to be able to be a non-relativist about truth. Yeah, I'm not sure that that's really an issue. In fact, it seems to me that, look, um, what a relativist might say here is, well, okay, the idea of deflationism is that, when I say that a proposition is true, so when I say that P is true, that's in some way like equivalent to just asserting the proposition. But then you can say, well, all right, whether a proposition is assertable is dependent on one's perspectives. So whether it's true is dependent on one's perspective. Um, a relativist does not need to suppose that there is anything more involved in evaluating P is true than what is involved in evaluating P, right? So when I evaluate the claim P is true, I'm just going to appeal to exactly the same resources that I would use in evaluating the claim P. But it's just going to be that in both cases, I'm necessarily appealing to the resources of some perspective or other. And there's going to be, the thought is, well, there's just going to be no privileged perspective. That's all the relativist needs. Um, so, and I think as well, it's important to bear in mind that, so as a relativist, you don't need to say that relativism is part of the content of any truth claim. So when I say P is true, it's sometimes thought that the relativist has to say that what P is true means is something like P is true relative to some perspective. So in other words, if I say, like, the sky is blue is so the sky is blue is true, the thought is that relativists are committed to treating that as an abbreviation. They're committed to treating it as abbreviating the sky is blue is true relative to perspective X. But I actually don't think that that's the case. Relativists can just say the sky is blue is true, or it is true that the sky is blue. They can just say that, and then whether or not we're relativists or absolutists is just some further philosophical analysis of truth. So in the same way, if you are an absolutist, presumably you're not going to take it that P is true has to abbreviate the claim P is true absolutely, right? So I don't think that. So I think we can just talk about things being true or false, right? And when we talk about things being true or false, we don't have to make so just in stating in stating that something is true or false, we're not invoking any particular commitment to relativism or absolutism. We're just saying that things are true or false. It's only when we engage in some philosophical analysis of truth and falsehood and so on that we might commit ourselves to relativism or absolutism. So I think that even for a relativist, truth claims can be taken in this kind of straightforward deflationary way that the deflationist suggests. So even a relativist can say, yeah, like P is true is just equivalent to saying P. That's it. Or equivalent in some important sense. Okay, so let's see. Right, well, I think that's enough for that video. I may well make another video about this topic. I don't really know if... yeah, I'm sure there's probably a lot more to say about this, but I just wanted to talk a bit briefly about, some of these traditional truth theories, because it really seems to me like there isn't any obvious incompatibility between relativism and the traditional theories of truth, at least. So yeah, that's all. That's what I wanted to talk about there, and I will see you in the next video.